This morning, I have the distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce one of my favorite people on the planet. Jan Carlberg is here to speak this morning, and some of you will remember her from last year. Jan was the first lady of Gordon College for 19 years when her husband Judd was the president. Judd had a long run, and so Jan Carlberg was the Jen Hammond back in the past. And Jen is a wonderful heart. Her husband Judd really helped to shape this campus over his time as president. Her husband Judd took a flyer on a youth pastor from New Hampshire and hired him 25 years ago. And that is me. And Jan, over the years, has spoken from this platform, and God has used her to bless lives and to shape hearts. She's a great communicator. She's a wonderful storyteller. She's a proud Norwegian. And she loves Scandinavia. She may even talk about her mother at some point today. Jen's also an author. Two of her books are The Hungry Heart, Daily Devotions from the Old Testament, and her second book is The Welcome Song, Other Stories from a Place Called Home. And Jan, it is so good to have you here at a place that will always be your home. So let's welcome home Jan Carlberg.
Time to have to keep clapping, isn't it, for somebody you don't know? It's good to be here. Speaking of Sunday school songs, I was thinking of one when I was a kid, and it went like this. I'm not going to sing it or I might just get coughing again, but it goes, "Cheer up, you saints of God, there's nothing to worry about. Nothing to make you feel afraid, nothing to make you doubt. Remember Jesus loves you, so why not be happy and shout? You'll be sorry you worried at all tomorrow morning." Well, when I was a kid, I never questioned that at all. But I'm 83 years old now, and I know there's a lot to be afraid of. I know there's a lot to worry about. And I also know that doubts come. I always liked what Frederick Buechner wrote from the first time that I read it. He said, "Doubt is the ants in the pants of faith. It keeps us moving." Well, the last time I was here was in February, and I talked about the heart. February seemed an appropriate time to do that. Today I want to talk about feet and mouths. Don't worry, if you invite me back, I'm not planning on going through all the parts of the body. So about the mouth. In Ephesians 4:29, in the NIV, it says, "Don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen." The ESV says that it may give grace to those who hear. Grace is one of those words that hasn't gotten messed up in the media, like evangelical or born again. Grace, people seem to have kind of an idea of what that's about. Sometimes they think of it as grace, something you say before you grab your meal, or it's somebody being gracious or grace towards somebody, which is respectful and thoughtful and kind. When I was a kid, I was 10 years old. My daddy was a pastor, and we had moved from DeKalb, Illinois, to a little country town in Georgia. Well, one day at recess, after I'd been there maybe a week, a group of kids gathered around me at recess, and I thought, uh-oh. And one of them said, "Talk to us. You talk funny." And I said, and then they said, "Where y'all from?" And I said, "I'm from DeKalb, Illinois." And I realized that I sounded different to them as they sounded to me. That up north, I was 10 years old. Now I was 10. We get known by accents, by dialects. And I've come to think that grace is the dialect of the language of God. Grace is the dialect of the language of God. It's how people can say, "You talk different. You talk different. Where y'all from?" Something's happened to language within our culture. It's gone down and down. I read somebody the other day that said somebody opened their mouths and graffiti spilled out. What we say connects us to what we believe or say we believe. So what would grace sound like or look like in our culture? I think, first of all, grace listens. We're a very loud culture. Grace listens, and it listens long. Everything doesn't have to have a comeback. Everything doesn't have to have an answer. Some colleges and university campuses have made the news lately because of protests that goad more than inform. Sometimes churches and some Christians confuse onlookers with our mean-spirited and know-it-all diatribes. We need to listen to our words and how we sound to people who want nothing to do with Jesus or nothing to do with the church. And no, the solution is not for church and state to be one. I like what G.K. Chesterton said a long time ago. While coziness between church and state may be good for the state, it's bad for the church. Why? Philip Yancey said, "The state runs by the rules of ungrace. It gradually drowns out the church's sublime message of grace." Yancey goes on to say, "A state government can shut down stores and theaters on Sunday, but it can't compel worship. It can arrest and punish KKK murderers, but it can't cure hatred, much less teach about love. It can pass laws making divorce more difficult, but it can't force husbands to love their wives or wives their husbands. It can give subsidies to the poor, but it can't force the rich to show compassion and justice. It can ban adultery, but not lust, theft, but not covetousness, cheating, but not pride. It can encourage virtue, but not holiness." So grace listens long, and it listens to people who differ from us. Y'all talk funny. Sometimes our reactions add to the confusion and feed the anger. I have a little saying that's carved into a little tile. I'm thinking about getting it made into buttons, you know, the kind that you pass out at campaigns. It says, "I'm sorry I pushed all your buttons. I was just looking for mute." We need to trust God for wisdom to know when to remain silent, to hit the pause, the mute button, and when to speak. The language of the dialect of the language of God, while it listens long, it also sings. Gordon has a wonderful music department. People come from all over to the concerts. We have 3 Gordon's students, Isaac and Jessica and Jake, who sing in the choir at our church. There are choral scholars there, and I go to different events at elementary schools and so on, and I'll meet other Gordon alums who are there teaching music. Grace sings. Sometimes when you just don't feel like whatever it is you're supposed to be doing, you can get some music on, and all of a sudden you can get at whatever it was. That's part of the language of God, the dialect of God that sings. I love the story, though it's a startling one, about Paul and Silas that you read about in Acts, the 16th chapter, when they're prisoners, and they're singing at midnight. They're singing praises to God, and it says in the text that the prisoners are listening. People listen to what we're listening to. People listen to what we're singing. People listen to the fact that we would dare to sing in hard times. But those that are identified as having the dialect of grace from the language of God need our songs. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. Be careful, little words, mouth, what you say. Be careful, little feet, where you go. Peace like a river. These songs, they get into us, and they either enforce and reinforce what we believe, or they pull us away. Sing those songs of grace that move us along. There's this in the Old Testament, it says in Psalm 137, I think it was, alongside Babylon's rivers, we sat on the banks and cried, remembering the good old days in Zion. Alongside the quaking aspens, we stacked our unplayed harps. That's where our captors demanded songs, sarcastic and mocking. Sing us a happy Zion song. Oh, how could we ever sing God's song in the wastelands? There are prisons, people in prison around us. They need our songs. There are people in wastelands who've been discouraged and hung up their harps. They can't sing anymore because they've lost something they thought they would never ever get back again. When you're known by the dialect of the language of God, you sing. I like music, almost all kinds. But because I'm a storyteller, I especially like some country music because they tell stories. Tim McGraw sings a song written by Laurie McKenna, words that she hopes her children would learn from. And it's called Always Be Humble and Kind. Don't expect a free ride from no one. Don't hold a grudge or a chip, and here's why. Bitterness keeps you from flying. Always stay humble and kind. Know the difference between sleeping with someone and sleeping with someone you love. I love you ain't no pickup line, so always be humble and kind. The chorus says, hold the door and say please and thank you. Don't steal, don't cheat, and don't lie. I know you got mountains to climb, but always be humble and kind. When the dreams you're dreaming come to you and the work you put in is realized, let yourself feel the pride, but always be humble and kind. We're living in mean-spirited times. One can text, rant, rate, say, post all manner of lies, truthiness, facts out of context, and sometimes hide temporarily behind anonymity. The music we listen to and sing reinforces what we believe. The words we text and write reinforces or denies what we say we believe. Watch our words. Grace be known by the dialect of grace, so people know you speak the language of God. Well, in August, our family gathered in North Carolina. We gathered there for all of us at this beach house, wonderful old beach house with wraparound porches and rocking chairs and those ceiling fans. And we were singing this last night. We did it more than that, but just this last night we'd gathered on the porch. My son was on the banjo, my grandson was on guitar, and we were singing, or they were singing lots of pop and folk and all kinds of music. And then I knew some of it and sang on some of it, but I just plain enjoyed all of it. And then all of a sudden my daughter said, "Mama, what would you like to sing?" Well, while I was thinking, she said, "How about Amazing Grace?" And I thought, that's perfect. Because even in this culture, people don't know it as a hymn. A lot of people will know that first verse of Amazing Grace. So there we were, a family, some Christians, some not Christians, but everybody singing away on Amazing Grace. And it was a perfect song. When I looked over my 83 years, we were celebrating it that night. We'd had a shrimparoo, boiled shrimp, peel it, dip it in the sauce, corn on the cob, salads, fresh coconut cake made by my niece, sweet tea with lemon. Oh, it was perfect. And so then we started to sing that. And everybody sang away. And suddenly on the second verse, I realized I was singing a solo. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. It's grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Grace sings somehow and encourages others to come along. Like it did for those prisoners and the jailer in that Philippian jail a long time ago. And then grace, that dialect of God's language, it prays. It prays for where our feet go. Our feet matter. Buechner said, when you wake up in the morning, called by God to be a self again, if you want to know who you are, watch where your feet take you. Because where your feet take you, that's who you are. None of us got to this place where we are by ourselves. People have prayed for us. Parents, grandparents, pastors, youth workers, friends. Jesus has prayed for us. We're here for a purpose grander than we can imagine. When I was younger, and probably you too, learned Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he'll direct your paths. And then Micah 6, 8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Even an old country song, always be humble and kind. Well, I want to tell you a story. It's almost Thanksgiving, and then it means it's almost Christmas. Well, I grew up in this Scandinavian family, and as you already know, my daddy was a preacher, they would have said in the South. You might have said pastor up here, but he was a preacher. And we'd gone to this, we were in this, well, anyhow, we'd been in the South in Georgia and later moved to North Carolina. But Christmas time was special. We were Scandinavian, and so we celebrated on Christmas Eve. Christmas morning was a stocking, but Christmas Eve is when we opened up our presents. But unlike a lot of places today, when you would come into our living room and see the Christmas tree, which was always a real tree, you would find not a whole bunch of packages, but packages. And like in The Sound of Music, brown paper packages tied up with string. Well, that's how they were. Brown paper packages tied up with string. And there was 3 for each of us. 3 for my 2 brothers, each for them, and 3 for me. I was the eldest. Well, what would happen on Christmas? The days before, our house would smell wonderful with baking all kinds of great things that Mama baked and I helped. And then we decorated, and the house was filled with music. You know, those old vinyl records playing on a big old piece of furniture that was called a high fidelity, Magnavox, radio, and record player. It was something else. You could have just worshiped in front of it. It produced all these wonderful sounds. Well, the house was full of music, full of good smells. When Christmas Eve came, the table was all set, everything was ready. It was just wonderful. And so, Daddy being a preacher and all, when it was time after the meal was over, and by the way, we went into the kitchen and did the dishes. There's no leaving them sitting out there and doing them later. Everything decent and in order in case Jesus showed up. You didn't want dirty dishes sitting all over the table. So they were cleaned up and put away, and then we came on into the living room. And Daddy was sitting in there like King Tut with his big old King James Bible on his lap, and he'd be reading the scripture to us. Well, because he was a preacher, he didn't just read Luke 2, which would have been long enough. He had to go back to the prophets. So we had to have Isaiah in there too. Well, I'm just getting as antsy as my brothers, and then we sang Christmas carols. So that's okay. You know, music, it helps. I already said that. It's the truth. And so then came time to open the presents. Well, in our family, we could count on 3 gifts. Number 1, new underwear. Number 2, new pajamas. Number 3, a surprise. Well, I was a newly minted teenager. I was now 14, and I knew what I wanted, so I was hinting every which way I knew how to hint. And back then, we had a store called Sears, which has gone out of business, and a great big old catalog called the Sears Catalog, which was thicker than a big old phone book. And it was full of everything you could imagine, everything you could ever wish for but probably didn't need, but it was full of all of it there, from John Deere tractors on down to kinds of hard candies you could order from them. Well, I knew what I wanted. I went to the shoe pages. I wanted me some high-heeled shoes. Girls were wearing them my age, and they were high back in the 50s. And so I circled the one that I wanted, and I circled it so much, it was practically perforated. You could pop it right out of the page. And so I'd sort of leave that open like that all wherever I possibly could, where those pages were there, hinting as best I could as to what I wanted. Well, Christmas Eve, you know how you do before. If presents are laid out, you kind of crawl around under the tree and see if you can get a clue. Well, I knew the feel of underwear. I knew the feel of pajamas. And when I saw something with my name on it, it was not a shoebox. It was about this size and about that high. And I thought, unless they're inflatable, these are not my shoes. And so one of the worst sins in our family was to be ungrateful. And I was trying to think of how I could be thankful for whatever was in there when it wasn't my shoes. And so what happened then was my brothers, the youngest first, there came his underwear. There came his pajamas, those Denton sleepers with the feet in them. And then he opened up Tinker Toys. Oh, he was so excited. He was off there playing with all the little wooden sticks and things. Then my brother opened his underwear, his pajamas, and his erector set. Oh, he was ready with all that metal trying to figure out what to do with that. Well, then it came time to me. I opened my underwear a little more privately. I opened my pajamas, and then I said, Lord, help me, as I opened up my package. And what was there was a scrapbook. It was back then, I mean, now you'd call it burgundy. Back then we called it maroon. And I felt like I was marooned when I looked at that, tied together by a shoestring. And I opened it up, and the pages were already yellow, like it had been around for a long time. But then I started going through it. And there, all of a sudden, I opened up a page, and there was a cutout of a picture of a poodle skirt. Poodle skirts were real big, by all the girls back then, but we didn't have money for poodle skirts. But I was surprised my mama and daddy knew that that was the thing girls wanted then. There was a picture of it. Well, it was almost as good as having it. Opened up another page, and there was a little silver picture of a little silver four-leaf clover ring. Well, girls had those back then. I didn't have one. I knew not to ask for it. But it was almost like getting it, to know Mama and Daddy knew I would have liked that. I kept looking through, and there in the centerfold of that book, pair after pair of high-heeled shoes, including the one I had perforated. But at the very bottom, my parents had said this: Janice, we heard you. We saw. We knew what you wanted. And there were so many things we wish we could have gotten you. We know you live in a culture that what's on your feet is really important. But we believe it's more important where your feet go. So while we would have loved to have gotten you all these things and more, our gift to you is we're going to pray for where your feet go all the days God has us on this earth, and that you will always walk in the ways of God. Love, Mom and Daddy. Grace to pray for what we really need. Not always what we want, not always what we ask for, but grace to follow in the ways of God. Now, I never knew as a little girl in Georgia that one day in 1976, after living in Michigan and Colorado, Illinois, Georgia, North Carolina, my husband and I would end up at Gordon College, the place we grew to love to call home. So I look at you and a whole lot before you ever showed up as my children and then my grandchildren, adopted. I'm grateful for you. I pray for you, not by name, but I pray for you, for President Hammond and Jen, for the wonderful people that are a part of this place. And so I say to you, while they're coming on up here to lead us in some music, I pray for you that you will speak words that build up, not tear down. You'll speak words that give grace to those who hear you, and that you'll walk in the ways of God, always. Always walk in the ways of God. There's nothing easy about following Jesus, but there's nothing better. Amen.